So what is GitFlow? Well, as you can see in this diagram, it's a little bit complicated, but it mainly consists of two branches that are always going to be consistently there, and that's the develop branch and the main branch. You also see the other ones like hotfix, release, and feature. Those are temporary branches that we use to transport code essentially. So if we start from bottom to top, that is the release cadence that we want to push our code through the different branches. Now, if we start at develop, let's say there's a new feature that needs to be developed by a developer. They have a feature request for it. They'll come in, they'll take a branch from the develop branch as it is, and they'll work on that feature, doing multiple commits just to test it, make sure the feature is working, and once it's feature complete, then we'll merge it back into the develop branch. And at that point, we would have multiple features with multiple developers working on them, and they'll all be working in a sprint that's usually 2 to 3 weeks on multiple features. And then at the end of the sprint, we would be merging that code from each of the feature branches into the develop branch, and that would be putting the state of development for that sprint in a release state. So we would take a branch of that code as it is at that time, and then we would make a release branch. And this release branch is what we use to push the code into all the different environments. So usually you have a test environment before you go to production, but you might have many different environments that you have in between. So you might have a test environment, a QA or a UAT environment, pre-production, and then production. So this release branch is used to take that code through each of those environments all the way up into production. And once it's released into production, that's when it's merged into the main branch. And that's essentially the version release of whatever those features are. And once that code is merged into main, we no longer need that release branch. So we just delete it and never see it ever again. But we still need to have a history of what features are released, versioning with version numbers and things like that. So once it gets put into main, we take a tag off of that code base in main branch. And you don't see it here, but there's an option where you tag it, and that essentially captures the code base of what that code is during that release. And then you just have a history of tags of the different versions. So if you ever need to take a branch off of a particular version of that application, you can use tags to do that. But when you go to production, there's usually some things didn't go quite as planned. Maybe something was missed and there's a bug and you need to hotfix it. So we can't go all the way back down to development, create a feature branch to fix the bug and then put it through all the different environments into prod. Because if it's a really critical issue, you need to fix it really fast in production. So that's where the hotfix branch here comes in. And essentially that is a copy of the current code base in main, and that is used to test and fix whatever that problem is. And once the developer's happy with it, it'll be merged back into main, and then that fixes the issue, and then that's the new code base that we have in the main branch. But we also need to make sure that that code fix, that bug fix, is populated back down into the develop branch. Because if we don't do that and a new feature gets developed and released, it's going to go back into the main branch, but it's not going to have that hotfix in it. So it's likely that that's going to revert the fix and the issue is going to pop up in production again. So it's very important when you do a hotfix that when you fix it and you push it back into main, that you also push it back down into development so that that fix is included in any future releases. So that is kind of GitFlow in a nutshell, but there are situations that I found where the release branch can actually be explored into multiple different branches if you want to be able to track exactly what code base is in each environment. So what I like to do for myself is break up that release branch into permanent environment branches. And that's what we'll dive into this course, where that release branch will become a permanent test branch or QA or UAT or pre-production branch. And that way we're no longer creating releases or release branches. We're just releasing the code between the different environments. And that allows us to more easily track what code is in what environment when. So how do we set up a project with branches and repositories and all the things we really need in Azure DevOps? To start with, create a project if you haven't got one already. It's just once you're in Azure DevOps under your organization, just click on New Project, give it a name, make it private, and just make sure that version control is set to Git. Default is Git, so you shouldn't need to go in here to check, but version control that we'll be using is Git. I won't create one because I've already got the one that I want, but just click create once you've got that in there, and then go into the project itself. And the first thing that we want to go to is repos, which is the repositories. And in here, you'll see any existing repos that you have. But for this one, we'll create a new one. And to do that, in the top here, you can just hit a drop down and click on new repository. So for this one, it's just what we're going to be using to test all of the different branch validations and how we do the pull requests and how do we approve releases and things like that. So I'm going to maybe use Hello World as an example for that. So I'll just call it Hello World without caps lock on. And we'll use that as our repository. You can add a README if you want. It doesn't really matter. You can just leave the settings default. It just puts a file in there for the initial commit. And that's set up our repository for us to be able to use. So next thing that we want to do is set up the branches that we want in relation to GitFlow. So if you remember, I talked about GitFlow previously. The main ones that we want in terms of branches is the main branch, which comes by default, and the develop branch. So we can create the develop branch now. I can spell it. And that just takes, make sure based on main is selected, because that takes whatever's in main and makes a copy and puts it in the develop branch. But since we don't have anything in there at the moment, it's just going to take that README file and nothing else. So the develop branch is the one that we're basically going to be running off most of the time. And when we do full releases, we're going to be merging it into the main branch. But as we went through GitFlow before, we'd create maybe a release branch off of develop, and then we would merge it into the different environments and then commit it to main when it goes to production. So we've got our two branches now, develop and main, and we want to work on, let's say, a new feature that we want to eventually release into production. So we'll create a new branch and we'll call it feature -v1, and that's based off of the current state of development. And this is the feature branch that we're going to be working on as a developer. Now, the request is that they want to change the README file to include some additional text in the README. Let's say, hello world, I'm a change in the code. And we would commit that. And now we say, okay, the change is in. It's also got spelling mistakes, but whatever, it doesn't matter. And we want to put that now, that feature is now ready, so we now want to put it into the develop branch. So to do that, we go to pull requests on the left. And that's essentially pulling the code from one branch into another. So click new pull request. Give it a title. Let's say feature into dev. And we want to make sure that we are pulling from feature into the develop branch, not the main branch. And we can see here on the files, there's the change that we made. And this is the commit that we did. So we create that. And this is where we have the pull requests, where you have things like stage gates, peer reviews, things like that. If there's any conflicts in the code, it would also pop up here. But right now it's very basic. We don't have any reviewers or tags or work items or comments or anything like that. But we'll get into how to structure that in the future steps. So now, okay, we can see in this pull request, we've got the correct changes. Okay, let's complete that pull request and we'll do a merge. And we don't have any associated work items, so that doesn't really matter. And we'll say delete the feature branch after merging because we don't need it anymore. So we complete the merge, and that's put the code from the feature branch into the develop branch. So now if we go back to our branches and we can see there's only two here again. Go to develop, go to the README, and we can see, hey, there's our new code update. It's now in the develop branch. Okay, so now develop is now in a state where we want to do a release into the production environment. So we create a new branch, which is now release v1. And we base that off of the develop branch. And this branch here, which has the code in it that we just put in the develop branch, is the code base that is going to be used when we do pipelines that releases the code into the different application environments. We don't have any pipelines yet, so we can't really run any of that. We can't do any build validations or peer reviews or things like that. But just for the example of how this works, we'll just go straight to doing a pull request. We'll say, yep, all of the releases are done. It's gone into test and QA, UAT, pre-production, and production. And now we're happy to commit that code into the main branch. So release to prod. And it's going from our release branch that we made into the main branch. And we can see, well, it's got two changes in there. That was one that I did before that I didn't show you, but you can ignore that. And then click create. And then same thing, click complete. We want to delete the release after merging and complete. And that has merged the release into the main branch, which is our production code. So back to branches again. And if we look under main, we can see it now has the addition that we made. So as you can see there, we went straight from develop, and there's a whole bunch of release pipelines that would normally happen to go into the other environments, and then we went into production. But what I like to do is to create some more static branches that represent the other environments like develop and main do. So let's create those environments. And let's say we have like quite a few environments. We have test. We'll base it off develop normally because we want to push upwards. So we'll create a test branch. And we want to create a QA branch. And we want a UAT branch. And let's say preprod. branch. So now that represents a branch for each environment. And then we no longer really need to create any branches apart from feature branches off of the develop branch when you're working on different developers are working on different things and we merge it into develop. But now we don't need to create release branches. We just merge the code from develop to test, from test to QA or UAT, and then preprod, and then main. But how do we ensure that that is actually going to happen? Well, we need to put policies on the branches. So we want to make sure that none of these are allowed to have any kind of pull requests put into them unless they come from the previous branch. So we only want to allow merges into preprod if it's coming from UAT or QA. And we don't want any branches having pull requests into test unless it's coming from develop. So how do we do that? Well, we go into, let's say, test, for example. And actually, we can just from the screen go to the right. There's the 3 dots. And we go to branch policies. And as soon as you put a branch policy on any branch for anything, it makes it so that you can't delete a branch on commit, which I'll show you a little bit later. So let's say we want to make sure that at least one person approves any code going into the test branch. Sometimes having linked work items is a good idea if you use the work items in Azure DevOps. If you use like work items in something like Jira, then it's not going to be applicable. Comment resolution is usually pretty good because if someone has a question about the code or why is it done like this, you want to make sure that that question is answered and resolved before the commit can take place. Limit merge type, you can make sure that only certain types are allowed. I typically don't enable that, but you can if you want to limit those merge types. And then we have the build validation. And build validation is basically a pipeline that runs, and you select the pipeline when it's created. And when it runs, if it's successful, then it passes the build validation. And that is essentially the pipelines that are going to be pushing the code into the relevant environments. So let's say, for example, I want to have a build validation pipeline that pushes a resource into Azure. Then I would put that as the build validation pipeline, because once I run it, then I know that the code is pushed into that environment and it's successful, so the code's good. So if the code's good, then I can do the commit. And I'll go into the details of what exactly that build validation looks like once we have pipelines established. But you would essentially just click plus, and you need to find the pipeline that you've created, when to trigger it. Usually I would just say manual when we trigger it, but I'll go into all of the details on what these different settings means once we actually have a pipeline in place. And automatically include reviewers is also quite good when you have, let's say, certain people that need to approve any changes going into test. Then you would have like a security group that contains those test approval users, and then you would just come in here, click plus, and you would search through your Azure AD or Intro ID on what that group is or who those users are, and it would automatically add them as an approver to the branch. So just for now, as an example, I'll just leave it at that, and then we'll just go back to the branches itself. And you can see that now test has a branch policy on it. So now that we have those branches set up, how do we make sure that only those branches can be committed from the branch before it? So making sure that only develop can go into test, only test can go into UAT, we'll remove QA from the equation just to make it a bit more simple. So making sure UAT can only go into preprod and preprod can only go into main. So that ensures that the code is going through the different environments before it can actually make it into the main. And then you would also want to allow things like hotfix to go into main. And develop will not have any validation because there'll be many different feature branches that you'd want to continuously commit, and they'll all have different branch names when putting them in, including hotfix. So starting with test, we would want to implement a test validation pipeline. We would click here and we would go to branch policies, but we don't have a pipeline set up for that build validation just yet. So in order to set that up, I've gone ahead and in my development repo, I've put in this common folder. And in here, I have a template for setting up the YAML pipeline. And essentially what this does, if you can read through it, it looks for what is the allowed source branch name that you want to be able to be commit to this branch. And you can see that it basically says if this branch is accepted, then proceed and mark the pipeline as successful. If it doesn't match the pipeline that's accepted, then fail the pipeline, and that fails the build validation. And then this is the templated one, and these ones here are all the different environment validation pipelines that it runs off. So let's have a look at the test one. That's basically saying the allowed source branch for test is develop, and this is the actual pipeline that we'll be adding into the build validation step. So I'll provide all of the code for this in this lesson so that you can download it and use it for yourself. But we also need to make sure that not only that the code is here, but the pipelines themselves are created. So how do we do that? On the left-hand side, we can go to pipelines, and we just click on new pipeline in the top right, and we say Azure repos git is where our code is under hello world, and we have an existing YAML file that we want to use, and these files are under the develop branch, and then we see them in here. So the first one that we want is the test branch validation. So we'll select that, click continue. You can see the code's in there, looks good. And in the little drop down next to run, don't run it, click save. And then we need to rename it, give it something more relevant, which is test validation pipeline. And then you'll see it updated there. Okay, and we click all and we can see that's our pipeline, no runs yet, which is expected. And we'll just need to do that for each of the other environments, which I'll do now. Okay, so now that we have all of those pipelines set up, we can use them to be build validations. So let's head back to repos, and we'll go to our branches. And on the right-hand side of test, go to branch policies. In here, we have build validation on the right, click plus, and this is for the test environment. So we want to select the test branch validation. Now we want to make sure that this is automatically triggered whenever the pull request is established. We don't want it to be a manual run. The only time we want manual build policies is for the pipelines that actually release the code to the environment. And we want to make sure that it's required for the build to succeed in order to complete the pull request, because that means that the correct branch was merged in. And we'll always just put immediately, if there's any code updated, it'll expire the build. So this is test build validation. click save, and that's on there now. And now that now we'll be able to see that if we go back to the repos and branches, test now has a symbol next to it. This branch has policies. So now we need to make sure that we do that for each of the branches. And now we have done them all. We can see that each of the branches now have these build branch policies assigned to them. The only one that doesn't have a branch policy is because we don't want to put any build validations on develop. We want people to be able to just commit without having to validate which branch it comes from. But we do want to make some general policy changes to each of the branches. Because develop doesn't have any branches on it right now, you can just delete it. Or if you do a merge, if you merge develop into test, there's an option that you can select to delete the develop branch once the pull request is finished, which we don't want because these are our main branches that we want to keep for forever. So we need to have some sort of policy on it to prevent it from being deleted. So we want some general ones that we want to put across all of them. So some of them that are quite good to put in is require a minimum number of reviewers. So develop, maybe you just want one, and you allow the requesters to approve their own changes. So these are developers, they can do pull requests into develop whenever they want, and they can approve their own pull requests into develop. Now, for larger teams, you probably want to restrict that to be a number of reviewers that don't allow their own pull request approvals, but this can work if it's a smaller team. And one of the ones that you want also is check for comment resolution as required. So if someone has a question about code that's going between these branches, then you want to make sure that that comment or that question is resolved before you can allow the pull request to complete and bring that code in. So these two are quite good to keep in. Linked work items is only relevant if you use work items in Azure DevOps. Some people use Jira, so it wouldn't be applicable, but you can use that if you do use that. You can also limit the merge types. I don't limit it generally, and I would just use a basic merge, but you can limit the merge types if you like. Build validation we went over. Status checks I don't generally use. Automatically included viewers is quite good to put in sometimes for, let's say, the test environment has a test environment approvers group. So you might have a group, a security group that has users in it, and you would add it in here, and you would search for it, and it would look in your Azure AD, or what is it called now? Intra ID, for a group of approvers, and you can make them optional or required. And whenever a pull request is created, they get added to the reviewers in the pull request, and it won't be able to be completed unless they approve it. And that's your basic approval gates that you have for each of the branches. So if we just go back to, let's say, we'll keep that as 2. We want comment resolution, and we'll just keep that the same for each of the environments. 2. Okay, so now we have the basis of our setup of how we have our branches structured, and we have some guardrails in place to make sure that only commits can come from the previous environment's branch. So next we need to look into the build validation pipelines that actually release code into a certain environment, and how we can put that in here to be manually executed to perform the code release into a particular environment. And for that, we'll need to set up some sort of resource like something in Azure, or something like using Terraform to automatically manage the infrastructure code. So now that we have that set up, we now need to create a release pipeline that is going to be able to deploy resources into an environment. So in order to do that, we need to create a new branch off of develop, because now that we have the policies in place, we can't do any direct commits to any of these branches. So for example, if I went into develop and I'd say, hey, I want to create a new file that's new pipeline dot YAML, click create, and then test and commit. And if I click commit, it says pushes to this branch not permitted. You must use a pull request to update the branch. So that's good. That's what we want. So we go back to our branches and we say new branch, and we call it feature new pipeline. And that's based off the develop branch. So we create that and we can see our feature branch there. No policy on it, so we can do direct commits to it. And we say again, new file, release, no, say deploy resources, file extension YAML, create that. Let's put some dummy data so that we can commit. Okay, and now we want to write a YAML pipeline that we can use to create a pipeline and run to deploy that resource. In order to create that pipeline, we can just use ChatGPT. I'm just using the paid version at the moment, but it'll still work the same with the free version. Just put in something like create a YAML pipeline that deploys a resource group to Azure with a PowerShell task. When you input that, it'll just generate the script that you want to use. And you'll just need to update it with the subscription that you want to use. The subscription is the connection within Azure DevOps. So I'll go through how to set that up in a moment. And then you just need to update what you want the resource group to be called and update the location if you need to. So you can just copy that code and then we'll use that when putting it into the pipeline itself. So in order to connect to Azure, in order to run that pipeline and create the resource, we need to create that connection to the subscription that I just mentioned. So in the bottom left corner of your project, you'll have project settings here. And then you can just go to service connections on the left and click on new service connection. And the one we want to use for the type is the Azure Resource Manager. And we want to make sure we use the recommended one, the Workload Identity Federation. And then it'll load up the subscriptions that you have access to. So I just have one at the moment, but if you have multiple, you'll have a list. So selecting my subscription, you can also select if you want to select a particular resource group. So if you are selecting a resource group, you'll only be able to give permissions to that particular resource group, but I'm going to leave it blank and just have it on the subscription level so that it has access to everything in the subscription and not just one resource group. So I'll just give that a name. I'll just call it Synapse Training Test. And I'll just grant it access to all the pipelines and click save. And what that's going to do is set up a connection to your subscription using a service principal. And we need to make sure that we grant access to the subscription for that service principal in order for the pipelines to work correctly. After creating that service connection, you'll now be able to go into it and you'll see Manage Service Principal. So now we can see the application registration that was created, and it's this big long name. So just we want to update that to be a bit more relevant. So just go to Branding and Properties on the left, and we can just update that to be the same name as the connection that we have in Azure DevOps. So call it Synapse Training Test because that's the name of the service connection that I made. Click Save. And now we need to copy the name of this, and we need to give that permissions to the subscription. So go to subscriptions on the left, select your subscription, go to access control, click add role assignment, and the role we want to give it is contributor role because we want to be able to create resources, but we don't want to have any rights to give permissions to anything else. So click next, select members, and paste in that name that we just called it, and select the application, and then click assign. We can see that that role has now been assigned successfully. So when we run the pipelines, that service connection now has access to be able to be used in the pipeline. Now that we have the build pipeline generated in ChatGPT and we have that service connection set up with the right permissions, now we just grab that code from ChatGPT and we just paste it in here into the YAML file that we created before. And I've basically just updated the subscription section here with my Synapse training test as the service connection, and I've just updated the resource group name to Hello World Test, and the location I've just left it as East US. I have noticed that sometimes when you create the script with ChatGPT, it can randomly decide whether it uses an Azure PowerShell task or a CLI task or something else. So your script that you generated through ChatGPT might be a little bit different, but they should all generally operate the same. Just make sure that you update the trigger at the top. Well, it's not required, but I've made it none instead of main as it was. Just because I want to trigger these pipelines manually and I don't want them to automatically trigger from any triggers based on branches. So we'll commit that, and that will be setting up the file that we have in this scenario for test. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing so that we have the structure like we have on the left here, and we have one for UAT, production, preprod, and development as well. We need to create a pipeline now that references each of these. So this is similar to what we did recently with the validation pipelines. So we can just go to new pipeline, get repo, hello world, existing pipeline in our develop. Well, actually it's in our feature branch that we created. And we will do deploy resources test. We see that there, we click save. And we rename it to deploy resources test. We go back, we can now see that deploy resources test is there. So now I'll just go through and set up each of those pipelines, and then we can continue. Now that we have all of those pipelines set up, we can go back to the repository and the build policies on the branch and set up the same validation pipelines for those new ones that have been set up. So coming back to the build validation, we click on the plus sign again. And this time we look for the deployment pipelines. So we have deploy resources test for test. And we want to set the trigger to manual this time so that we can pick when the release of that code is going into the environment. Keep everything else as it was before, and we'll just give it a display name. Test. And then you can see that whenever a pull request is created, it's automatically going to verify whether that validation is coming from the required branch. So for test, it'll be develop. And then we have a manual trigger for the build validation to deploy to test. And we'll take a look at what that looks like when we actually do a pull request and it becomes an option to be able to select. So if I go to the other environments now, I just need to set each of those. So for UAT, it'll be just deploy resources UAT, manual, deploy to UAT. Preprod will have deploy resources preprod, manual, and finally main branch to production. Prod, as we called it. So we'll see that develop now has deploy to dev, and then test and all the way up to the other environments will have the deployment as manual and the branch validation as automatic. So we need to be able to do a pull request now between the different branches to validate that all of this is working. But since I'm the only one that's doing these pull requests, we need to change this branch policy to be one reviewer and allow request approvers to make their own changes, to approve their own changes. So this you would generally not have because you would have a team of people and you'd need peer review done on pull requests. But for this scenario, I'll just have to make sure I change each branch to facilitate me being able to do it by myself. But once that's done, dev has already got the changes that we want. And now we're ready to do a pull request. So remember, we created a feature branch in order to make these changes because we can't do direct changes to the develop branch. So we've got the source of the pull request as the feature branch, and the target is the develop branch. So we'll just give that a name of any pipelines. We can see the different files that we've added and the code that's in each of them, and a history of the commits that we've done along the way. And then we just create that. And now we can see here that the build validations come up as checks. So if we look at view two checks, one is the comments. There's no comments at the moment, so it's succeeded. And there's deploy to dev. So for dev, we only have the one build validation, remember? So this is the only one that we need to queue up. But when we go to the higher environments, we'll need to have two checks that we run. But just to demonstrate what a comment resolution might look like, we would put what is this PR about? Once I comment, it's now flagged that as comments must be resolved before the pull request can be completed. So I'd just reply about the code that wrote, reply, but we can reply, but you want to do reply and resolve so that it flags that as a completed check. There also needs to be at least one approver. So I flag myself as being able to approve my own pull requests. So in the top right here, I just click approve, and then that validates that check. So now the only one left to resolve is the deployment. So we click queue, and we can drill into it to see the steps that it's performing. Yeah, we can see that the script that it run is now successful, and it created the resource group here. So to validate that, we pop back over into the subscription, Under resource groups, we should be able to see that in here as hello world dev. So we can see that that has been successful now. So going back over to our pull request, we can see that all the checks have now passed, and that now allows us to be able to complete the pull request. So in the top right corner, we can click complete, and we want to delete the feature branch after merging it into develop. And there we go. All of our code for that feature has now been put into the develop branch. So if we go back to branches now, we can see that all we have is our main branches for each environment. So how do we take that now to the next environment? Well, we just go back to pull requests, create a new one, and we take it from develop and we put it into test. And that sets up the source and the target. And we'll just call it deploy to test. And now that we have the pull request into test, if we have a look at these checks, we can see that the test branch validation succeeded. So it knows that the merge is coming from the develop branch, and there's no comments, but we still need to do the deployment to test for the actual resource deployment for that to be checked. So we simply just click Q, and that will trigger the pipeline as the same that we did for develop. We also have to approve it as well if it's going to be committed, so I'll just approve that myself. But usually if you have a team of people, you would have multiple approvers here. You would add them in as reviewers. And now we can drill in to see what the pipeline's doing to test. And it's just initializing the job. It's checking out the code, running the PowerShell. It's going to import the module again, and then it should create that resource group within the Azure subscription that we've set up. Okay, so that was successful. And we'll just wait for it to finish. Sometimes there's a UI issue where it keeps showing that a previous job is running, but it's not actually running. Like if I refreshed it right now, you can see that it's actually complete. So if we go back to the pull request itself, we can now see that all the checks are passed, and we can commit or complete the pull request. And you can see here now the develop branch can't be deleted because it has policies on it. So that's the main reason that we put policies on these ones that we want to keep forever, so that we cannot delete them. You can only delete a branch on a pull request merge if the branch doesn't have any policies on it. So we'll complete that now. And we can see that that's now completed. And if we have a look into the test branch, we can see all of our code is there. Okay, now we can do the same thing going into the rest of the environments. So next would be UAT, then Preprod, and then main for production. Now we can do a new pull request that's going to take the code from our test environment that we just pushed in and put it into the next environment up, which is UAT. But let's just test that our validation pipelines are working correctly. So let's say we try to go from test up to preprod, and we'll call it deploy to preprod. So this is just going to be skipping completely UAT in the middle. So let's see what happens when we try and do that. We can see that this is a pipeline validation that's automatically been queued up, and it's just going to run and check, is this source branch correct? Is it actually coming from UAT if we're going into preprod? But the one that we're using is test. So it should go and check and see that, that's not the correct branch. So we're going to fail that. And we can actually just wait here, or we can just drill into it to see the progress of the pipeline. And you can see it's already got a fail on it. So if we look at this, source branch is not allowed. Only the UAT branch is allowed. So that's working as expected, which is good. So if we go back to the pull request, we can see that that has failed. So we can actually just get rid of this altogether now. We'll just go back to our pull requests and we'll abandon this one. To abandon it, just in the top right corner here under the drop down, and click abandon. Then we go and make a new one from test into UAT and deploy to UAT. And that will do the same thing, and it'll go off, automatically queue this and check to see if the branch going into UAT is test. And that we can actually, well, we know that one's going to succeed because that's the way that we've set it up in the branch policy. But we also need to approve it again by someone, and then we also need to deploy to UAT. These can have some UI slowdowns sometimes. So, oh no, there it goes. So clicking on view 3 checks, we can see that that's now showing as passed. Okay, now we click on queue and we'll run it to deploy to UAT. One thing we didn't check previously is when we deployed to test, did it create the resource group in test? So if we go back over to Azure now and we hit refresh, we can see Hello World Test resource group is now there. So we know that that was successful. So now deploying to UAT, we can drill down into that pipeline to see what it's doing. And this will just be the same process that we've been going through with the other environments. We'll just wait until that completes. Okay, we can see that's now completed. So let's go back to the pull request. And we can see all checks have succeeded. And before we complete it, we'll just go back over to Azure, hit refresh. We can see the UAT resource group has been created. So we can verify that that is correct and click complete and complete the merge of the code. And that code is now in UAT. So now that we've done it into UAT, we can do our pre-prod pull request like we did before, but this time we know that the source is UAT. Pre-prod, deploy to pre-prod. And now that pre-prod branch validation is going to automatically run yet again. And this time it should succeed because the source is UAT, which is the approved source branch on the policy. Approve that. And then we should be able to see that running. And we can see at the top there, it's success. We go back, click checks. Pre-prod branch validation is now green. So we're good to go ahead and deploy to pre-prod. So that's just doing the same thing as we've been doing before. So we'll just wait until that finishes and then we'll do the merge complete. So now we can see that that is completed. Just go verify with a refresh. Yep, we can see that the pre-prod resource group is deployed. So now we can complete that pull request. And now that that's in pre-prod, we can go to production. So exactly the same process we just went through. So I'll just go through that and create the pull request into production. And then once that's complete, we'll show you what to do next. So we have the pull request here for going into prod. We'll queue that up. And we can see the main branch validation is also succeeded because it's detected that the pull request is coming from Preprod. And we'll just wait for that pipeline to finish deploying. Okay, we can see that this has passed now. We'll just quickly verify. Yep, we've got the production resource group created there. And then we can complete that pull request. And now all of our code has been deployed to all the environments, but we want to make sure that we take that state of code that is in main now so that we can keep that as historical release versioning. So we go to tags on the left and we click new tag. And we always want to base it off main, and we say maybe v1.0 release. Make sure there's no blank spaces. And this is created resource group. This is an example. And we create that as the version 1.0 release tag. So that has a historical code base there now that we can see. So if we ever wanted to create a branch that's not off an existing branch, but a tag of a version release or a code base that was at a state at the release, we click new branch, maybe it's a fix, and we base it off of the tags here. And we click that tag, and then we click create, and that's going to create a new branch that we can work off based on the code in that tag. And that's how we keep the historical code for our applications. So now that we've tested getting our code all the way through all of the environment branches, there's some additional things that we can look at to make some tasks a bit more automated in terms of approvals for branch approvals for pull requests. So what we can do is go to the branch policies and look into automatically included reviewers. So if I don't want to have to add myself as a reviewer or add other people as a reviewer, we can add people individually to each of these branches. So you might have someone who owns the test environment or someone who owns the UAT environment, and you want to be able to make sure that any pull requests that go to those environments, they are automatically added to the branch policy or the pull request. So let's say we want to go to test. So let's add, or actually let's start with develop because that'll be easier to test. I will click on plus, and let's say I want to make sure I'm always automatically added to develop because that's the environment that I own. And there's an option here where you can make it required or optional. So they can automatically be added to it, but it's optional if they approve it or not. But generally you want to make it required so that they have to approve it in order for the pull request to complete. So I'll just keep that like that and click save, and we see that here I have been added as a required approver. So let's say we go do a pull request now. Or actually I need to make a branch with an actual difference in the code. So let's just say test branch, base that off develop, test fix, try that. And I'll just say something in the README, like I'll remove this test stuff that we had in there before. And we commit that and do a pull request from test fix into the develop branch. And we can see our update there, remove that text, create the pull request. And you can see here that Brian Hodson must approve. And it's got me as a required viewer there. And you can see there's a little policy icon there. So you can see if there's any pull requests with a bunch of required approvers in there, if they have it, it's been automatically added. If they don't have it, then you know that they've been added manually on the pull request. So that's a good way to tell who's been added to need to be approving these pull requests, or if it's automated. And then I would just approve that. That's got a tick next to it now, and over here it's got a tick. And then we would just run that as we normally would and be able to complete the pull request. So we have individual users automatically included as reviewers. But what if we want to include a group of people? So let's say there is a group of test environment owners that we want to include all of them, and we don't want to manually put every person in here because it could be a big list. We want a group, and we want to sync that group from Azure AD, or we can create it direct from Azure DevOps. So in order to create that, we need to go all the way back to our organization settings and go to users and group rules. So if we add a group rule and we say create a new Azure DevOps group, and we call it develop group with user Ryan, basic access and to our project. So we click that, and that's going to do a little bit of a sync. And we can see that I'm in there now. So now we can go back to our project, and we go back to our branches, and we'll go to the develop branch, and we'll add that group, develop group. And we want to say minimum number of reviewers, 1, because I'm the only one. But if you have, let's say, a group of 3 people, you can have 1 of those 3 people approve it, or if you need all of them to approve it before it gets merged, you would say 3, or however many people are in that group. So there's some good options there if you want to add some more approval security in the gates. And then you click save. And then if we go back to our pull request under here, and we say new pull request, test fix into develop, click create, and it's got me and the develop group. So actually we probably want to remove my individual assignment from that. I'll just open that in a new tab, and we'll remove me. So now it's only the group. I'll refresh that, and we can see that I'm still added there, but the policy is no longer enforcing it. So we can just remove me, and we see a member of develop group must approve. So if I approve it now, it says this group was approved by me. So if another member of the group, if there was like 3 members and you only needed 1, it would say whoever approved it, who is part of that group, has approved it. But then it also puts an optional approval of my account itself in there. And then we would just queue up the pipeline, do the deployment, and do the merge once we've got all of the checks ticked. So that's how you manage the group aspect of who can approve what. Now, what if you want to add a group like that, but you want it to be synced from Azure AD instead of just a group that's created in Azure DevOps? Well, we need to create another group by creating a group in Azure first. So we'll say, we'll call it relatively the same. Develop group, but we'll put AD, and I'll add myself as a member. And then under here, we'll just give this a refresh. Back where we created the develop group, we would just say add group, and we would search for develop, and we can see the AD one is there now. So we would give it the basic and the project access as well. And project, you can keep it default contributors or whatever you want them to be, and the rights for the project itself. So we add that now, and that's added in. We can see that's an AD one, and we go back to here, and we'll just remove that one for now. And then we'll add in the develop group AD. You can see it says team foundation now. We'll keep it as one reviewer like before and save. And then we can see that the AD version 1 is set there. So let's go back to our pull request. And we can see that the AD one is there now. Let's just remove me and remove that. And refresh. Okay, and now it says the AD group user must approve. And then you can see there that it's been approved by me, and you can see that this is as part of the policy. So those are two options of creating a group in Azure DevOps itself, or in AD in Azure, or Intra ID as it's called now, to include many different users as part of a group for approvals. One other thing that can be done is once you start making these changes for these policies on multiple different repositories within your project, it can become quite cumbersome because you have a lot of clicking to do. And if you look in just the develop branch itself, you have to turn on the minimum required number of reviewers, comment resolution, you have to put in build validation, you have to put in automatically included reviewers, and then you have to do it for all of the other environment branches as well. And if you have multiple repositories that you want to follow this, you have to manually do that one by one, and it can be quite cumbersome to do that. So one thing you can do is under the project repositories themselves is you can go to it here and go to policies, and there's branch policies right here. So what you can do is click the plus and say protect the current and future branches matching a specific pattern. So for example, if we put develop, we can see it's going to match these that we already have across multiple different repos, but also it's going to do it for any future ones that we create as well. So if we create that, we can then say, okay, we want to have a minimum number of viewers, we want to put in comment resolution, and then we want to put in our build validation pipelines and our automatically included reviewers. And it's going to automate a lot of those policies across the future repos that you want to create. But just keep in mind that if this project has a lot of existing repositories before you start doing this, it might have some unintended changes and overwrite some development branches that you have in other repos that have been there for a while. So it's probably best to set this up when you're working on a new project, or if you don't have any policies for anything else just yet, then it's safe to do this. I won't save that for now, but you can do it for develop and test and all the other environments, because you're going to have the same environments across multiple different repos, because multiple repos is usually you have it for specific functionalities in a particular application, and the project is for an application as a whole. So once you implement that, just keep in mind that the different functions that you have for the different repositories, you probably don't want to add the build validation for releasing the code itself. That one you probably want to configure manually, because you might have some code that is going to have some variations between the different repositories. But definitely the build validations for verifying the branch is coming from a lower environment, that you can definitely put in place. So that's just some things that you can do in order to automate some of the manual setup for that when you want to expand it out a lot bigger. So that covers everything. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next course. Thanks.